There's been a lot of discussion about Aquarius this year, 2021. If you're a modern astrologer, it may have been about Uranus, the modern ruler of Aquarius, squaring Saturn and Jupiter. If you're a traditional astrologer, you may have been talking about the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in an air sign, starting a new cycle lasting 2 centuries. And the story of astrology that we all practice today, whether it's modern, traditional, or Vedic, has some of its roots in ancient Babylon, which also has a surprising connection with the very modern sounding conversation about the Age of Aquarius. Let me start, therefore, by saying that although we've all heard of the tropical and sidereal zodiacs, there are actually 3 zodiacs. Let's travel back in time about 3,000 years. The Babylonians were avid sky watchers, and among their observations, they noticed that although there are stars in the sky whichever direction you look in, the moon only moved through some of them. They identified 18 constellations in the path of the moon, and this is a sort of proto-zodiac. So next time you read an ill-informed article about why there are really 13 signs and all your friends ask you about it, you can tell them that that's nothing. The Babylonians had 18 signs, and here they are. Some of them look a bit familiar: the bull, the twins, the lion, and so on. Yep, this is where our zodiac signs that we use today originated. And to give you an idea of this early Babylonian zodiac, here's a picture of some constellations. The orange circle is the ecliptic that we all know and love, and because the moon wanders off the ecliptic by a few degrees, it visits other constellations too. You can see that this diagram of the 18 Babylonian constellations aren't nice and regular. There are some big gaps, and there are quite a few that are very close together. We don't actually know exactly what all of the Babylonian constellations correspond to in our modern terminology, but certainly all 12 zodiac signs are represented in this diagram. And here they are. And a lot of those have been unchanged since Babylonian times. Now, the problem with using constellations to identify where a planet is that constellations sprawl quite a lot. Here's a picture of the night sky with some stars and some planets, but let's take a closer look at this picture with a clearer diagram. Now, this is the same diagram as the last picture, and it shows Mars, Venus, and the moon. And we might ask, what constellation is the moon in? And it's pretty hard to say. The constellation of Aquarius overlaps the constellation of Capricorn, so the moon could be said to be in both. Using modern boundaries for constellations, and these modern boundaries are completely artificial, of course, they're like town boundaries, the moon is technically in the constellation of Capricorn, but it's not at all obvious. Not only that, but constellations aren't nice, neat 30-degree intervals that we're used to. Here's another picture of the night sky. It's one that you're probably not familiar with because it's a fairly faint part of the sky that most of us don't really look at very much. But I'll show you what the constellations are by drawing those lines in. And we can see here big, bold Aries and shy, retiring Pisces. This constellation is Pisces. So what about big, bold, in-your-face Aries? Well, I'm really sorry to have to tell you this, Aries, but this is you. Yeah, I know, tragic. So sticking to our 12 constellations, we have a sort of zodiac. The orange circle is the ecliptic, planets never stray far from it, and the constellations are shown round the outside. It's a bit fiddly to use because some constellations overlap and they're clearly all different sizes. So let's say that we want to formalize this. We want 30-degree segments, and we want to base our zodiac on the stars that we can see. This is called the sidereal zodiac, and we want to tidy up these constellations a bit. We need a starting point, and of course the problem with circles is they don't have a beginning and an end, so we have to define one. And we do have one extraordinarily beautiful piece of symmetry in the sky. There are 2 bright red stars in the night sky, Aldebaran, the eye of the bull in Taurus, and Antares, the heart of the scorpion in Scorpio. And by an amazing bit of galactic symmetry, they're exactly opposite each other from our perspective, literally opposite, within about a minute of arc. And one system for a sidereal zodiac makes use of this, and it defines Aldebaran and Antares as being 15 degrees of Taurus and Scorpio, respectively. They're like the poles in sidereal astrology. And there is another method which defines the bright star Spica in Virgo as being at naught Libra. There's not a huge difference between using this definition and the previous ones, but there are slightly different sidereal systems. They're all roughly result in roughly the same calculations. And by using one of these definitions, we can create a sidereal zodiac with precise 30-degree signs, where each sign roughly corresponds to the constellations in each sign. Yes, there's some overlap, and some signs sprawl over more than one sign, but you can see that they broadly match up. And the other way of defining a zodiac is to base it on the Earth's seasons. When the length of day and night are equal, it's an equinox, and we have two of those. We have a spring equinox and an autumn equinox. And Ptolemy, in his Tetrabiblos, defined the start of Aries as being the position where the sun was at the spring equinox. And this technique is called the tropical zodiac. And at the time that Ptolemy was writing, there wasn't a lot of difference between the sidereal and tropical zodiac, but Ptolemy and other Greek writers before him were aware of a phenomenon called precession, which meant that the two zodiacs drift by about a degree every 72 years. Ptolemy actually thought it was a degree every 100 years, but that doesn't matter. The principle's still the same, which is that the tropical zodiac and the sidereal zodiac are drifting apart from each other. Now, Ptolemy was writing 1800 years ago, so with that much time passing, the tropical and sidereal zodiacs have drifted quite a bit since his time, almost a whole sign, in fact. And this means that we have three zodiacs. Look at the red dot on this diagram. Let's say that's Mars. We can see that Mars is nestling in the constellation of Pisces, but it's in the sidereal sign of Aries, and it's in the tropical sign of Taurus. So what's all this got to do with the Age of Aquarius? Well, it's all to do with the drift of the tropical zodiac. At the spring equinox, the sun is always at 0 degrees Aries in the tropical zodiac. But where is it in the night sky in the sidereal zodiac? Well, this diagram shows the position of the sun at the spring equinox from 1000 BCE right up to 3500 CE. When the Babylonians were making their observations 3000 years ago, the spring equinox was in the constellation of Aries. In other words, if there'd been a total eclipse of the equinox and you could see the stars behind the sun, you'd see the stars of the constellation of Aries. By 500 BC, it was starting to drift into Pisces, but depending on how you divide the constellations up, it was sort of still in the constellation of Aries. But by 1 CE, the equinox was definitely taking place in the stars of Pisces, which is why many people see that period, shortly after the birth of Christ, as ushering in the age of Pisces. And at some point, the spring equinox will move into the stars of Aquarius, and we can see from this diagram that's a long way off. By the year 3000, it will have moved away from the oversized constellation of Pisces and be nudging into Aquarius. By 3500, it will definitely be right in the middle of the constellation of Aquarius. So by 3500, we'll definitely be in the age of Aquarius. And the boundary between Pisces and Aquarius is pretty vague. When does that shift take place? Because there's an awful lot of empty space there. However, this makes one huge assumption. This slide shows the constellation of Pisces, and Pisces is generally described as a symmetric pair of fishes. The Babylonians called it the swallow, and a swallow's tail is V-shaped. But the constellation isn't symmetric. It's a V shape, but it's got a huge loop on the end. Why? Who says that the symmetric fishes need a huge loop? What is that loop? Who says that that loop is part of Pisces? Ptolemy, that's who. He catalogued over 1,000 stars in great detail in every constellation that he knew about. His catalogue, in a book called Almagest, was so detailed that it was used as the basis for a formal definition of the constellation definitions and boundaries, which were formalized in 1930 by the International Astronomical Union. And if Ptolemy had made any mistakes, those mistakes were set in stone, and they're still there today. Ptolemy describes each star in the loop. The one shown here is described as the southernmost of the two stars in the top of the head of Pisces. So he clearly saw this loop as being Pisces. Now, the addition of this loop to Pisces makes Pisces a really big constellation. It means that it occupies almost 40 degrees of the ecliptic, while neighboring Aquarius only occupies about 20 degrees. But was this Ptolemy's addition? How did the Babylonians view the constellation of Pisces? Well, the Babylonians had been observing stars and planets for well over 1,000 years by the time Ptolemy wrote his Almagest. And they'd been providing reports to the kings of Babylon for centuries. And they continued to do so when Babylon fell first to Persian rule and then Greek rule. And we still have records of these reports today in clay tablets. And here's one of the observations of Jupiter in the 18th year of the reign of King Artaxerxes in 387 BCE. In the 7th month, and they started their year in late March, early April, and months always started with the new moon, they noted that Jupiter became stationary on the 23rd day of that year and did so in the rear basket of Aquarius. Now, we can easily work out when the 23rd day of the 7th month of the 18th year of the reign of King Artaxerxes was. It corresponds to the 18th of October 387 BCE. And using modern software, we can see that Jupiter did indeed station then, and we can see where it was. It's by the loop of Pisces, except the Babylonians clearly didn't think that was Pisces. They thought this was the rear basket of Aquarius. Now, this has a major implication from when the Age of Aquarius starts. This diagram shows the constellation of Pisces with the loop, which the Babylonians considered to be Aquarius. So the boundary between Pisces and Aquarius isn't off in the distance. In this model, the last visible star in the symmetric constellation of Pisces is the red dot indicated by the Greek letter omega. Omega looks a bit like a small W, and that star is called a megapiscium. The first star in Aquarius is either Iota or Lambda Piscium. Iota looks like an I, Lambda looks like an upside down Y. So we can take our pick of which of these stars is the boundary between Pisces and Aquarius. And to answer the question, when does the spring equinox hit that star, depends on how we drop the plumb line to either the ecliptic, that's the orange line, or the celestial equator, which is the blue line. And the orange line and blue line will always intersect at the current equinox. So I've just drawn the current positions in. But as those stars aren't exactly on the ecliptic or the equator, we can choose which one to drop the plumb line to. And this gives us several possible dates for the start of the Age of Aquarius, all of them much earlier than the year 3000. So depending on how you calculate it, we may have been in the Age of Aquarius since the Industrial Revolution, or it may have just started just a few years ago, or it might be a century or four up the road. So take your pick.